The clinking of silverware and the soft murmur of quiet conversations filled the air in the small upscale restaurant. The warm glow of pendant lights cast a calm, inviting ambiance across the room. In the far corner, an elderly man sat alone at a table for two. His face, lined with age, held a peaceful expression, but there was something undeniably enigmatic about him. His eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the room as he absent-mindedly stirred his drink. The man, Kevin Costner, had a presence that seemed to stretch beyond the ordinary, though few in the room knew it. He wasn't just any old man enjoying a meal. There was a story behind those eyes, a past that could shake the very foundation of anyone who dared to uncover it. It was just another night, or so it seemed, until the door of the restaurant swung open and a group of men stepped inside. They moved with purpose, their leather jackets creaking with every step, and the faint scent of expensive cologne clung to them like a second skin. Their eyes scanned the room, landing on Kevin as they made their way to the bar. They were out of place, too loud, too brash for this serene atmosphere, and they knew it. Kevin's gaze flickered toward them, his eyes narrowing slightly as the group settled at the bar. His instinct told him something was off, but he didn't move. He had long ago learned to trust his instincts. He returned to his drink, the ice cubes clinking as he took a slow sip, his posture relaxed but alert. It was then that the leader of the group, a man with a scar running down his face and a cocky grin, caught Kevin's eye. The scarred man smiled, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice rough but loud enough for Kevin to hear. "You know, this place is a little too fancy for someone like you." Kevin didn't respond immediately. He simply raised an eyebrow, his gaze not leaving the man's face. It was a challenge, unspoken but clear. The leader of the group took a step toward him, his boots scraping against the floor, his movements slow and deliberate. The other men followed, each one a little too eager, as if waiting for a confrontation. Kevin's calmness only seemed to fuel their excitement. "You look like you've seen some things," the scarred man continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe you've even done some things, or maybe you're just another old man who thinks he's tough." There was a brief silence. Kevin set his drink down, the glass making a soft sound against the table. His hand lingered on the glass, but his eyes never left the scarred man. The air was thick with tension, and the restaurant, which had been filled with the comforting sounds of conversation moments before, now seemed eerily quiet. The waitstaff moved in the background, trying to ignore the growing tension, but everyone in the room could feel it. Kevin finally spoke, his voice calm with a steady, almost soothing tone. "You're making a mistake," he said, his words simple but firm. "I'm not the one you want to mess with." The scarred man laughed, but there was an edge to it, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "Oh, really? I think you'll find I've dealt with plenty of people who were a lot tougher than you." Kevin didn't flinch, he just sat there as if waiting for something. His expression was unreadable, yet there was a glimmer in his eyes, something that hinted at more than met the eye. The group of men, still unsure, shifted uncomfortably, sensing something wasn't quite right. But none of them were prepared for what was coming next. The scarred man, his grin slowly fading, took another step closer to Kevin. His eyes were narrowed, as if trying to figure out the old man's game. The other men, sensing their leader's hesitation, stood still, their eyes flickering between Kevin and their boss. A tense silence hung in the air, thick with anticipation. It was clear now that Kevin wasn't the typical old man he appeared to be. There was something about him that made the situation uneasy. Kevin, however, seemed almost unfazed, as if he had been through far worse than some loudmouths in a restaurant. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms casually, his eyes never leaving the scarred man. The moment felt frozen in time. The leader was the first to break the silence, though his voice was a little less sure this time. "What's the deal with you, old man? You think you're some kind of tough guy?" Kevin smiled ever so slightly, his lips curling in a way that suggested both amusement and something darker. "I don't think anything. But you might want to reconsider your approach. People like me, we don't need to prove anything." The words were simple, but they carried weight. A few moments passed, and for the first time the group of men seemed to hesitate. They were used to pushing people around, to taking control, but there was something different about Kevin. His composure, his silence, everything about him suggested he was far from the frail target they had imagined. It was a small shift, but it was enough to make the leader take a step back. "Whatever," the scarred man muttered, trying to regain some of his bravado. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't belong in this place. It's for people who know how to behave." Kevin's gaze flickered briefly toward the restaurant's entrance, his mind calculating something. The scarred man's words, though harsh, hadn't rattled him. If anything, they had ignited a spark within him. Kevin had seen this kind of thing before, the arrogance, the bluster, but he also knew that it wasn't always the most obvious threat that was the most dangerous. The power sometimes came from within, from knowing what to do with the situation when it mattered. Before Kevin could respond, the waiter, a young man in his early 20s, nervously approached the table. He had been watching the scene unfold, clearly uncomfortable with the rising tension. He glanced at Kevin, then at the group of men, and his eyes widened. Gentlemen? Is there something I can help with?" the waiter asked, his voice shaky. The scarred man shot him a sharp glare. "Stay out of this, kid," he growled, but the waiter didn't back down. He stood there, uncertain but determined, as if unsure whether he should protect his customers or just run for the door. The tension was palpable. Kevin could sense it all, the waiter's fear, the underlying anger from the group of men, and the creeping awareness that this was not going to end quietly. He turned his attention back to the scarred man. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Kevin's voice was softer now, but it carried a weight that made the room feel even quieter. The leader looked at him, confused, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Kevin let out a sigh, leaning forward slightly. His voice dropped to a level that only the man could hear. "Kevin Costner," he said, just above a whisper. "You've seen the movies. You know the name, but I'm sure you've got your own little problems to worry about." The scarred man froze, his eyes widening as recognition slowly spread across his face. Kevin Costner, the man who had played the roles of heroes and legends, the man who had held his own in countless battles on screen. But this wasn't a movie. The realization hit like a cold wave. The room seemed to still for a second, and the other men shifted uneasily, unsure of what to do next. But Kevin didn't wait for their reaction. He leaned back in his chair again, casually, as if he had all the time in the world. The threat that had once been so palpable in the air began to dissipate, replaced by the understanding that this wasn't just any old man. This was Kevin Costner, and everything about the situation had just changed. The leader of the group swallowed hard, his earlier confidence crumbling. You're him?" he stammered, taking a step back. Kevin didn't say a word. He simply nodded once, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't arrogance, but calm, a calm that came with years of experience. There was a brief moment where time seemed to stand still. The men around the table exchanged uneasy glances, their previous bravado quickly evaporating. The moment stretched on, the tension in the room thick and palpable. The leader of the group stood frozen for a few moments, his mind struggling to process the revelation. Kevin Costner. The name hung in the air like a weight that no one knew how to handle. The others in the group exchanged looks, some of them beginning to shift uncomfortably. The realization that they had crossed the line was hitting them, but none of them knew how to back out of it gracefully. Kevin remained seated, his calmness the stark contrast to the chaos brewing around him. He wasn't worried. He knew that situations like these had a way of resolving themselves. It was just a matter of letting things unfold. The scarred man, however, wasn't ready to back down so easily. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the back of a chair, as if trying to regain control of the situation. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice gaining a bit of edge. "You're still just some old man in a restaurant. You think your name scares me?" Kevin didn't flinch. He simply looked at the man, unbothered. "No," he said slowly, his voice a perfect blend of calm and authority. "But I think your stupidity just might." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the scarred man's pride. It was clear now that Kevin wasn't just a famous actor. He was someone who had lived through much more than the group could imagine. They had walked into the wrong situation, and Kevin knew it. The group was about to find out just how badly they had miscalculated. For a moment, the scarred man seemed to consider his next move, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. But before he could speak again, a new voice broke the silence. "Is everything all right here?" It was the waiter, still standing nearby, his face a mixture of fear and concern. He had been watching the exchange, clearly not sure whether to intervene, but he had seen the group of men go from confident to uncomfortable, and something told him that the situation could escalate quickly. Kevin glanced at the waiter, then back at the group of men. His calm demeanor never wavered. "Everything's fine," he said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. These gentlemen were just about to leave. The scarred man opened his mouth to respond, but Kevin's gaze was unwavering. The confidence that had once filled the room with aggression was now replaced with doubt. The weight of Kevin's calmness, the realization that they had underestimated him, was beginning to sink in. One of the other men, younger and less sure of himself, shifted uneasily on his feet. "Maybe we should go," he said quietly, his voice filled with hesitation. This is stupid." The leader shot him a look of contempt, but his posture had shifted. The intimidation that had filled him moments ago was now replaced with uncertainty. Kevin, without saying another word, stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He was an imposing figure, even without raising his voice, and the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted accordingly. The power had shifted back into his hands. The scarred man, still grappling with the situation, took a step back, his pride bruised but his will intact. "We're not done here," he muttered, barely audible, but it was clear he was reluctantly accepting defeat, for now. Kevin didn't respond. He simply nodded toward the door, a silent gesture urging them to leave. The rest of the group hesitated for a moment longer before turning to leave, their footsteps echoing in the once peaceful restaurant. As the door swung shut behind them, the tension that had built up began to dissolve, but Kevin remained still, his eyes scanning the room. The waiter, still holding his breath, stepped forward cautiously. I didn't know who you were," he said, his voice still shaky but with a note of gratitude. "Thank you, that could have gone really badly." Kevin offered him a smile, a small, reassuring gesture. "Don't worry about it," he said. Just doing what needed to be done. As the group of men disappeared into the street, Kevin returned to his seat, the tension of the encounter still hanging in the air, but no longer threatening. He took a deep breath, as though he had been holding it for longer than he cared to admit, and allowed the calm of the restaurant to wash over him once again. The evening, though disrupted, was not over. Kevin's calm demeanor remained, but there was a lingering sense of unease. Something was still not quite right. Kevin sat in the stillness of the restaurant, the echoes of the confrontation slowly fading into the background. The air, once thick with tension, had returned to its usual calm, though a sense of unease lingered. The encounter with the group of men had not been a random one, and Kevin could feel it in the pit of his stomach. There was more to this than just a few young punks trying to make a name for themselves. The situation was far more complex, and Kevin was certain that this was only the beginning. He glanced around the restaurant, noticing the staff returning to their normal routines, the soft clink of cutlery, and the murmur of conversation resuming. But his mind was elsewhere, focusing on the events that had just unfolded. There was something about the way the leader of the group had acted, something familiar in his tone, a hint of fear masked by bravado. It wasn't just the threat that he had posed to Kevin. It was the way he had responded when Kevin had revealed his identity. It wasn't the reaction of someone who had just realized they had insulted a celebrity. It was the reaction of someone who had encountered a much more dangerous adversary. The waiter, having returned to his post, glanced over at Kevin with a mix of curiosity and caution. He was clearly trying to process the strange scene that had unfolded. Kevin gave him a small nod, acknowledging the quiet gratitude still in the air, but he didn't engage in conversation. He was lost in his thoughts, piecing together the clues. The scarred man's strange reaction, the sudden shift in their behavior when they realized who he was. Kevin knew these weren't just random punks. They had been sent. As the minutes passed, Kevin's unease grew. His instincts were telling him that this encounter, though seemingly over, had planted the seed for something much larger. Someone had orchestrated this, someone who had known exactly where to find him. The question was, why? The waiter, still cautious but driven by an unspoken need to connect, approached Kevin's table. "Is there anything else I can get you, sir?" he asked, his voice soft and respectful. Kevin looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "No, thank you," he said, his voice calm but tinged with an underlying sharpness. "But I'd like to know something. Have you ever seen those men before?" The waiter blinked in surprise. No, I don't think so," he replied, his brow furrowing. "They came in about 20 minutes ago, but I've never seen them here before. They seemed like they didn't belong." Kevin nodded slowly. That confirmed it. They had been out of place, not just in the restaurant, but in the city. This wasn't some random act of aggression. It had been planned, methodical. They had targeted him for a reason. "Thank you," Kevin said, his voice once again calm. The waiter nodded and, sensing that the conversation had ended, walked back to the kitchen. Kevin sat in silence for a while, the weight of the situation settling on him. He knew that whatever this was, it wasn't going to end with a simple confrontation in a restaurant. There were people out there who knew who he was, people who had found him, and they weren't going to stop. It was then that he realized that his life, though quiet on the surface, had been anything but calm. The roles he had played in films, the legends he had brought to life on the screen, those stories, though fictional, had created a reputation. But somewhere along the way, those stories had bled into the real world. He had always known that fame came with its own dangers, but this felt different. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping softly against the floor. His movements were deliberate, his expression hardened by the thoughts racing through his mind. He had to get to the bottom of this. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed answers, and if it meant digging deeper into a past he had long kept buried, so be it. As he walked toward the door, he glanced over his shoulder, taking one last look at the restaurant. For the first time, the familiar setting seemed foreign, as if it were part of a world he no longer belonged to. Stepping out into the cool night air, Kevin felt the weight of what was to come. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And whatever lay ahead, he knew he wasn't going to face it alone. The streets outside were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The night air carried a hint of chill, and the hum of the city felt distant, almost irrelevant to the storm brewing in Kevin's mind. As he walked, his steps steady but purposeful, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on him. It wasn't just the group of men in the restaurant. Something larger was at play, and Kevin knew that he couldn't face it alone. As he made his way down the familiar path to his car, his thoughts raced. He could feel the weight of the years of playing characters who always had a way out, who always triumphed in the end. But this wasn't a movie. There was no script to follow, no director to yell, "cut," when things got too dangerous. This was real, and it was unfolding at a pace that made it hard to keep up. He reached his car, the engine humming softly as he opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. As he buckled up, he looked at the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the shadows of the men from the restaurant following him. But there was nothing, just the empty street behind him. Kevin's hand hovered over the ignition for a moment, his mind calculating his next move. It wasn't enough to simply drive away. He needed more information, and he needed it fast. He had been in this game long enough to know that the longer you stayed in the dark, the harder it was to see the way out. The phone in his pocket buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He reached for it, his eyes flicking to the screen. It was a text from an old contact, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. "I heard you're in town, thought you might need a little help. Meet me at the usual place, midnight." The message was brief, cryptic, but the familiar tone was unmistakable. It was from David, an old ally from his past, someone who knew the world Kevin had once navigated, a world of shadows and secrets that few ever saw. If there was anyone who could help him understand what was going on, it was David. Kevin didn't waste any time. He turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life. The car pulled away from the curb and into the quiet night, the sound of the tires on the asphalt the only noise that filled the car. His destination was a safe house, a place where he had gone to lick his wounds after more than one dangerous encounter in the past. It wasn't much, but it was secure, and it was exactly the kind of place he needed right now. As the city lights flickered by, Kevin's thoughts turned inward. What had this all been about? Why had those men come after him, and who had sent them? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. They were coming for him, and it wasn't going to stop until he found out who was pulling the strings. The safe house appeared in the distance, a nondescript building tucked away on a quiet street. Kevin pulled up to the curb and parked his car, scanning the area before he got out. He had been here countless times before, but tonight felt different. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he approached the door. He rang the bell, his finger pressing firmly on the button. The door opened a moment later, and there stood David, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a face that had seen its fair share of hard times. But there was something about his eyes, sharp, calculating, always watching, that made it clear he was still very much involved in the dangerous world Kevin had once been part of. David didn't speak at first. He simply nodded, stepping aside to let Kevin in. "You've got that look," he said finally, closing the door behind him. "What's going on?" Kevin didn't hesitate. He had trusted David before, and he wasn't about to stop now. "I've been targeted. There's a group of men who came after me tonight. They knew who I was, but that's not all. Someone sent them." David raised an eyebrow, but his face remained stoic. "That's not good. You're not just an actor anymore, Kevin. Your past is catching up with you." Kevin nodded, the words weighing heavily on him. "I know. I need your help to figure out who's behind this, and I need it now." David's eyes narrowed. He walked to a desk in the corner, rifling through a drawer before pulling out a file. "This is going to be tricky. You've been out of the game for too long. Whoever's after you knows that. But they also know how to find people like you. We've got some catching up to do." As David began to pull up information, Kevin sat down, the gravity of the situation settling in once again. The safe house, which had once felt like a refuge, now seemed like a place of uncertainty. Kevin had stepped back into a world he had tried to leave behind, and there was no going back. The past had come knocking, and it was going to take everything he had to stop it. The room was dimly lit, the flickering glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The hum of a computer filled the silence, and David's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, pulling up various files and documents. Kevin watched him intently, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the puzzle in front of him. Every new piece of information David uncovered seemed to lead to another layer of mystery, one that only deepened Kevin's unease. "So, what do we know so far?" Kevin asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. It was as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile calm that had settled over the room, a calm that only heightened the tension. David paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the screen before turning to face Kevin. "I've dug through some old contacts, people I trust. Whoever is behind this, they've been tracking you for a while now. I found traces of surveillance footage from several locations, restaurants, parking lots, even your old neighborhood. They've been watching you for months." Kevin frowned, his brow furrowing as he processed the information. "Months?" His voice was sharp now, the realization of the situation finally hitting him. "How could I have missed something like that?" David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You were out of the game for a long time, Kevin. You were living a life that most people would envy, a quiet existence, the kind that shields you from the dangers lurking in the shadows. But people like you, well, they don't fade into obscurity easily. Your past has a way of catching up with you no matter how much time passes." Kevin's mind raced back through the years, the roles, the fame, the public life he had led. He had left that world behind, convinced that the quiet life he was living now would keep him safe. But the more David spoke, the more Kevin realized that there was no such thing as safety. Not when the past had a grip on you. "Do you have any idea who's behind it?" Kevin asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he clicked through a few more files, his face growing more serious with each passing moment. "There's a man," he said finally. "An old associate of yours. Someone who hasn't forgotten you. His name is Victor Ramos." The name hit Kevin like a punch to the gut. Victor Ramos. He hadn't heard that name in years, not since they had parted ways under less than amicable circumstances. Ramos had been a player in the underworld, a man who had always operated in the shadows. Kevin had crossed paths with him once or twice, but he had never thought that their brief interactions would come back to haunt him. "You've got to be kidding me," Kevin muttered under his breath. "Ramos? He's the last person I thought would be involved in something like this." David nodded grimly. "I know, but everything points to him. He's known for being vengeful, and he holds grudges longer than most people hold their breath. He must have a reason to come after you." Kevin leaned forward, his mind now fully engaged. "What kind of reason, and what's he planning?" David shook his head. "That's the thing, I don't know yet, but we can't afford to wait. If Ramos is involved, this isn't going to stop with some petty threats. You're in real danger, Kevin." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating in their finality. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that something was wrong, that the events from the restaurant hadn't been a coincidence, but now it all made sense. Ramos was behind it. The past had returned, and it was demanding something from him. As Kevin processed the information, he began to think back to his past with Ramos. The dealings, the power struggles, the deals that had gone sour. There had been a lot of bad blood between them, and Kevin had thought he had walked away clean. But maybe he had been wrong. Maybe Ramos had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "We need to find him," Kevin said finally, his voice firm. "I don't care how, but we need to find him now." David looked at him, a hint of concern in his eyes. "Are you sure you want to go down that road again? You know what it means to go after someone like Ramos. He's not going to back down, and neither will the people he's working with." Kevin didn't hesitate. "I've been down this road before, David, and I'm not running from it now." David stood up, his chair creaking under the weight of his decision. "All right, then we do this carefully. We need to track his movements, figure out where he's hiding. And we need to do it fast. If Ramos is behind this, then things are only going to get worse from here." Kevin stood as well, his mind already working through the steps. "We'll need backup. I can't do this alone." David nodded. "I've got a few people in mind. But remember, Kevin, you're not just fighting Ramos. You're fighting the ghosts of your past." The weight of David's words settled on Kevin's shoulders. The ghosts of his past were no longer distant memories. They were very much alive, and they were coming for him. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Kevin's mind, once quiet and focused on his peaceful life, was now consumed with one thought: finding Victor Ramos. The past had come rushing back, and with it, the dangers he had hoped were long gone. But there was no turning back now. He had stepped into a storm, and it was only a matter of time before everything collided. David had proven to be an invaluable ally, tapping into his extensive network and pulling together the resources Kevin needed. The information began to flow in quickly, but it wasn't enough. Kevin had learned long ago that in situations like these, speed was just as important as information. They needed to act fast before Ramos and his associates made their next move. The two of them met late one evening at the safe house. The room was dimly lit, with maps and files scattered across the table. David was seated at his desk, his eyes scanning through documents while Kevin paced the room, his mind constantly working. "Anything new?" Kevin asked, his voice low but laced with urgency. David glanced up, a slight frown creasing his brow. "There's a pattern here. Ramos is planning something, I can feel it. He's been moving in and out of certain locations, but he's keeping a low profile. It's like he's hiding in plain sight." Kevin stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "Where is he now? Where is he hiding?" David clicked through a few more files before pulling up a map on his screen. "I've traced some of his recent movements. I think he's been staying at a safe house, an old warehouse just outside the city. It's the kind of place he would use if he needed to lay low." Kevin leaned over the desk, his fingers tracing the map. "This is it then. We go there, find him, and we end this." David hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's not that simple, Kevin. Ramos isn't just hiding out. He's working with someone we don't know yet. I can feel it. Whoever's behind this, they've got their hands deep in the game and they're not going to let us get close without a fight." Kevin's expression hardened. "Then we'll be ready for them." David nodded, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. "We can't just walk in there, guns blazing. We need a plan. Ramos has resources, connections we can't even begin to understand. If we're not careful, this could turn into something much bigger than we're prepared for." Kevin's mind was already working through the possibilities. He had been in these situations before, had seen the way the underworld operated. He knew that going in without caution could be disastrous, but he also knew that time was running out. Every moment they delayed, every minute they spent gathering more intel, gave Ramos the upper hand. "We don't have time to waste," Kevin said, his voice firm. "We go in quietly, make our move, and get out. But we can't wait too long. Ramos has been waiting for something, and we need to beat him to it." David stood up, his eyes sharp as he regarded Kevin. "All right, we'll get a team together. But we need to be prepared for the worst. You're not just dealing with a petty criminal here, Kevin. Ramos is dangerous." Kevin's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what they were up against. But he also knew that if they didn't act quickly, Ramos would be the one calling the shots. And that was something Kevin couldn't allow. "Let's move fast," Kevin said, turning toward the door. "We'll hit him hard and fast. He won't see us coming." As they began to prepare, Kevin felt the weight of the situation settle in. He was about to face a man from his past, a man who knew him, perhaps better than anyone else. It wasn't just about fighting for survival. It was about confronting the ghosts of his past, the choices he had made and the mistakes that had come with them. But there was no time for regret now. The past had come knocking and Kevin was determined to face it head-on. The mission was set, the team was forming, and there was only one goal in mind: find Victor Ramos, stop him, and put an end to this madness before it was too late. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the deep blue of the night sky. The air was thick with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Kevin sat in the passenger seat of the van, his eyes fixed on the building ahead. His grip on the seat tightened as he stared at the entrance, the final destination of the hunt that had consumed his every thought for the past week. David was in the driver's seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The two of them had gathered a small team of trusted contacts, people from Kevin's past, people who had experience in situations like these. They were positioned around the perimeter, waiting for the signal to move in. But even with the team in place, the uncertainty lingered. No one knew what was waiting for them inside the warehouse. Kevin's thoughts raced as he watched the building. The plan was simple: get in, find Ramos, and get out. But as with all things in his world, simple plans rarely stayed simple for long. "Everything's ready," David said, his voice calm but with an edge that betrayed his own nerves. "We move in 5. Kevin nodded, his expression unreadable. He wasn't nervous. He had done this 1,000 times before, but there was something different about this mission, something that gnawed at him deep inside. This wasn't just about stopping a criminal, this was personal. Ramos had been a shadow in Kevin's life, lurking in the corners of his past, and now it was time to confront him once and for all. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second dragging on as Kevin mentally prepared for what was to come. His heart beat steadily in his chest, but the anticipation was almost unbearable. The warehouse in front of him felt like a barrier between him and the answers he so desperately needed. He had to face Ramos. He had to confront the man who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. David broke the silence. 5 minutes, get ready. Kevin's hand reached for the door handle, his movements deliberate. As he stepped out of the van, the cool night air hit him, but it did little to calm the fire building inside him. The team moved quickly, slipping into position around the warehouse, making sure to stay out of sight. Kevin stayed close to David as they approached the building, keeping low, his steps measured and silent. His mind was focused entirely on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to let his emotions take over. This was a mission. Nothing more, nothing less. They reached the back entrance of the warehouse, a rusty metal door that looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. David quickly disabled the lock with a small device he had brought with him, and within moments the door creaked open. The team slipped inside, moving quickly and quietly through the dark corridors of the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and old machinery. The warehouse was vast, the floor cluttered with crates and forgotten equipment. Shadows stretched across the room as their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating their path. Kevin's eyes scanned the space, his every sense alert. The silence was unnerving. He expected to hear the sounds of movement, the shuffle of feet, but there was nothing. It felt like they were walking through a ghost town, as if the building had been abandoned for years. They reached the main area of the warehouse, where the layout was open and exposed. The team spread out, moving carefully between the shadows, their footsteps echoing softly in the vast space. Kevin's hand went instinctively to the gun at his side. He wasn't expecting a fight, not yet anyway, but he wasn't taking any chances. "Stay sharp," David whispered, his voice low. "We don't know what's in here." As they moved deeper into the warehouse, the hairs on the back of Kevin's neck stood on end. There was something off about this place, something that didn't sit right. The air felt too still, too heavy, like they were being watched. Then from the far side of the warehouse, a voice cut through the silence, smooth and calm, yet laced with an edge of malice. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you, Kevin?" Kevin froze. The voice was unmistakable. Victor Ramos. The man had been waiting for them, ready. The calmness in his tone only served to deepen the tension. Kevin's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay composed. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for had finally arrived. Ramos was here in front of him, and he wasn't going to back down. "I've been waiting a long time for this, Kevin," Ramos continued, his figure slowly emerging from the shadows. "You've been living a peaceful life, hiding in plain sight, but you can't escape who you are, you can't outrun your past." Kevin's eyes locked onto Ramos as the man stepped forward, his expression dark and calculating. There was no turning back now. They were face to face, and everything was about to change. The cold air inside the warehouse seemed to thicken, each breath Kevin took heavier than the last. He stood motionless, facing Victor Ramos, his past, his enemy, the man who had spent years in the shadows waiting for this moment. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft hum of the old warehouse's faint machinery. Ramos stepped forward, a cruel smile playing at the edges of his lips. "You've really come this far, Kevin. All these years, and you thought you could just walk away. You've been hiding in plain sight, but you can't run from who you are." Kevin's jaw tightened, his eyes never leaving Ramos. "I'm done running, Ramos. This ends now." Ramos scoffed. "You think you've got the upper hand? This isn't a movie, Kevin. You don't get a happy ending. You're just an actor, a man who's always played pretend, and you'll always be that person." Kevin's grip on his gun tightened, but he held his stance steady, focused. "This isn't about a role, Ramos. This is real, and you're going to face the consequences." Ramos took another step closer, his hand slowly inching toward his jacket. Kevin reacted instantly, drawing his gun. The tension in the air exploded as their eyes locked. Two men, each carrying the weight of years of unresolved conflict. Kevin's gun was aimed steadily at Ramos, and the moment hung in the balance. The quiet of the warehouse was deafening, the gunfight looming in the air like a storm about to break. "You've always been too slow, Kevin," Ramos taunted as he reached for something hidden in his pocket. Before Ramos could make his move, Kevin fired first. The sound of the shot was deafening, ringing through the warehouse, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Ramos staggered back, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief. The blood began to seep from his wound, but his expression didn't falter. He had always been proud. His pride was his armor, and now it was cracking. Kevin's heart raced as he took a slow step forward, keeping his gun trained on Ramos. The man before him was faltering, but he wasn't finished yet. Not yet. Ramos let out a pained laugh, his hand still gripping his wound. "You think you've won, don't you, Kevin?" he rasped. "You're wrong. You have no idea what you've just done." Kevin's brow furrowed. His finger hovered over the trigger, but the sudden fear in Ramos's eyes told him this wasn't over. Before Kevin could process what was happening, Ramos fumbled for something in his other pocket, a small device, a detonator. Kevin's heart stopped. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice trembled slightly. Ramos, his face twisted with pain, grinned darkly. "You think I'm afraid of dying, Kevin? No. I've been preparing for this. I've been waiting for you." The cold click of the detonator echoed in the room, and for a moment Kevin believed he had lost, but nothing happened. No explosion, no immediate danger. Ramos's grin faltered as he pressed the button again. Nothing. Kevin took a breath, his body filled with the rush of adrenaline. He lunged toward Ramos, knocking the detonator from his hand and sending it skittering across the floor. The warehouse remained quiet, the threat neutralized in that split second. Ramos's expression shifted from victory to disbelief. Kevin seized the moment, pointing his gun straight at Ramos's head. "You're done, Ramos, it's over." The aftermath of the confrontation was surreal. The once tense air of the warehouse began to settle, leaving behind an eerie silence. Ramos, bloodied and defeated, was handcuffed by the authorities as Kevin watched, his gun still trained on the man who had haunted him for so long. David, approaching cautiously, gave Kevin a long, steady look. "It's done," he said quietly, a note of relief in his voice. Kevin nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Ramos, who was being escorted out by the officers. The weight of the situation hit him all at once. It was over, but in truth, the battle had been more than just a physical one. It had been about reclaiming his life, confronting the past that had never truly let go of him. As the authorities took Ramos away, Kevin felt no satisfaction, only relief. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they no longer had control over him. This chapter was closed, but Kevin knew better than to believe it was the end of the story. Some parts of your past never truly leave you. But for now, he could finally breathe, knowing he had faced his demons and won. And